It's not looking good for the Yes campaign.
It's telling one story, and the story is Australia's voting no.
It's now up to all of us to come together and find a different way to the same reconciled destination.
This is the referendum that Australia did not need to have.
We need to rebuild, and rebuild at the grassroots level.
I take no joy in it. It's been divisive.
I think the No campaigners have a lot to answer for in poisoning Australia against this proposition.
In the wake of Saturday's comprehensive referendum defeat, the question of where the country goes next on fixing Indigenous disadvantage is once again up for grabs, as is the question of constitutional recognition.
They've said no to grievance and the push from activists to suggest that we are a racist country when we are absolutely not a racist country.
The question of just why the referendum failed and who or what is to blame is just starting. Many Indigenous leaders are observing what they described on Saturday as a week of silence to grieve the result, which defers some of that discussion. Understanding where we go next involves understanding how we got here in the first place, how calls for Indigenous recognition in the Constitution have morphed over the years into the question that was put to voters on Saturday, which was about a lot more than just noting that Australia was inhabited when white settlers arrived. The 2023 referendum became one about dealing with the implications of dispossession, and in a form that Indigenous people themselves had determined. That meant a discussion about who makes policy and about how money is spent. The referendum's failure and what happens next therefore leaves all of those issues to be dealt with in a very different way. While calls for constitutional recognition had started to gather pace in the late 1990s, it was John Howard's 11th hour election commitment in 2007 which began a decade of debate about what constitutional recognition should look like.
This nation has spent and wasted a lot of time in the last 30 years toying with the idea of a treaty implying that in some way we are dealing with two separate nations. To me, this goal was always fundamentally flawed and something I could never support. If I'm re-elected, I will put to the Australian people within 18 months a referendum to formally recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution.
Hello! There were parliamentary inquiries, panels of eminent people, advisory councils, discussions about general preambles, changes to the race power in the Constitution, changes to the Racial Discrimination Act. But it was Tony Abbott who in 2015 began the process that would lead to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017 and the proposal for an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
What we now need to do is to end that echoing silence in our Constitution, the omission of Indigenous people.
It would, I think, renew the faith of a lot of Australians in politics if they were able to see some of the discussions.
But the Uluru Statement in 2017, calling not just for a voice as a practical form of recognition, but for treaty and truth-telling too, was a surprise to both sides of politics. By this time, Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, and in the face of a charge that the voice would be a third chamber of the Parliament, he rejected the idea. And in 2018, opposition leader Bill Shorten was still suggesting that a voice should be legislated first to demonstrate its worth. But as time moved on, the sense that the Uluru proposal on the voice should be put to the people gained strength and was embraced as a commitment by Anthony Albanese. The subsequent wording was largely determined by the architects of the Uluru Statement. But it did mean the question faced by voters was a much more complex one. It was also not going to receive bipartisan support.
Unfortunately, we've got to a position where we don't believe that this will genuinely close the gap.
A resounding no to the Prime Minister's Canberra voice.
But the Prime Minister and Indigenous leaders pressed on and finalised the wording of the question in March this year.
We have doggedly recommended changes to stop the deaths, the incarceration, the early deaths and the miserable lives, and it is so infrequently that our recommendations are adopted.
The campaign was ultimately marked by an inability of the Yes camp to either deal with the various criticisms that were made of the proposal or to clearly articulate how the voice would be structured and work. And considerable misinformation, much of it carried through social media and anonymous pamphlets.
So there it is. Anthony Green has called it at 7:24 p.m. The Indigenous voice referendum has been defeated.
The figures showed huge geographic, income and age gaps in the vote, from massive support in the inner cities to votes of up to 80% against in rural Queensland. Saturday represented not just a defeat of the voice, but the end of that long debate about constitutional recognition that had started back in 2007.
We respect what the Australian people have said, and they've made it very clear. On this particular constitutional amendment. But they didn't say that we don't want to see improvements in reconciliation. They didn't say that we don't want to see improvements in closing the gap.
Having suggested during the campaign that he would hold a second referendum dealing with just recognition, Peter Dutton had a different message today.
But I think it's clear that the Australian public is probably over the referendum process for some time.
In question time, the debate focused mainly on political blame rather than where we go next.
The $450 million referendum was against advice and resulted in our country being divided. Will the Prime Minister apologise to the Australian people?
It's interesting to get a question from the Leader of the Opposition about division. The Leader of the Opposition has never seen a policy that he doesn't oppose.
There are a lot of Indigenous Australians feeling pretty burnt today. But there are some silver linings in this as well. The vote in predominantly Aboriginal communities was really high. So that says to me that Indigenous Australians wanted this. What the government will do is let the dust settle, and we will be undertaking a process of finding out where people want to move next.